America just seized a Russian-flagged oil tanker suspected of moving oil toward China in the open Atlantic. And that one moment may have changed the rules of the ocean. Most people will hear that and think it's just another sanctions headline, another enforcement action, another ship, another story that disappears in a day. But this is not just about oil. It's about precedent. It's about who gets to project domestic law into international waters. It's about what happens when trade routes stop being neutral and start being contested. And once that shift begins, the next escalation doesn't need missiles. It needs fear. It needs insurance premiums. It needs one miscalculation in the dark. Because the ocean is where the global economy has always depended on one simple thing: predictability. Ships move, ports receive, insurers price risk, traders assume lanes remain open. People never think about it. The moment the ocean stops being boring, everything gets expensive, and politics gets dangerous. Now, the public narrative will be clean and familiar. The U.S. says this is sanctions enforcement, a crackdown on shadow fleets that move sanctioned crude for regimes that Washington wants to isolate. The ship, they say, is part of a network designed to evade pressure through name changes, flag swaps, transponders switched off, and paperwork games. They'll frame it as stopping smuggling, choking revenue, and defending order. Russia's narrative will be the mirror image. Moscow will call it piracy, overreach, a violation of maritime norms, a state using force against a properly flagged vessel in international waters. They will use legal language because legal language is a weapon. Russia doesn't need to be morally consistent. Russia needs to create doubt. Doubt fractures coalitions. Doubt scares neutral states. Doubt makes ports and insurers hesitate. And hesitation is how sanctions rot from the inside. And then there's the quiet third player, the one that matters the most if the cargo was even suspected of feeding Chinese demand networks. China. China will not frame this as a Russia story. China will frame it as a precedent story. Because Beijing's core fear is a world where a rival power can police global arteries under the cover of domestic enforcement. China doesn't need to love Russia. China needs energy security, and energy security is national security. The moment this starts looking like an interference pattern around routes connected to China, it becomes strategic. So here's what we're really watching. We're watching the system test itself. We're watching a contest over whether international space remains governed by shared norms or becomes governed by whoever can enforce hardest. We're watching a tug-of-war between legitimacy and raw power. And the longer that tug-of-war plays out at sea, the more likely it becomes that commerce turns into confrontation. To understand why, you have to understand how sanctions actually work. Sanctions are not just laws. Sanctions are a belief system. They work when enough of the world accepts the rules as legitimate, consistent, and enforceable. They work when enforcement is coordinated. They work when the target feels isolated not just by one country, but by a broader system. The moment sanctions start looking unilateral, the moment enforcement looks like one nation exporting its jurisdiction into international space, the belief weakens. When the belief weakens, compliance drops. When compliance drops, the enforcer is tempted to escalate, and escalation is where risk becomes real. That's why this kind of seizure is so sensitive. It's not merely a question of whether the ship violated U.S. sanctions in an abstract sense. It's a question of whether the world accepts the idea that U.S. domestic sanctions justify coercive action on the open ocean. If the world accepts that, Washington's leverage grows. If the world rejects it, Washington's leverage becomes more expensive to exercise. And when leverage becomes expensive, leaders either back down or push harder. Both paths reshape the system. Now let's talk about the thing most people misunderstand. The shadow fleet is not a fleet. It's a machine. It's a business model built on ambiguity. It's designed not to be invisible, but to be unclear. It survives through constant mutation. The ship changes its name. It changes its operator. It changes its registration. It changes its flag. It changes its stated route. It moves through transshipment points. It mixes cargo. It uses intermediaries. It turns tracking off and on. It creates just enough fog that proving origin, ownership, and destination becomes costly and slow. And in global trade, speed is power. The slower enforcement becomes, the more space the network has to adapt. Here's what makes this machine so resilient. Modern oil trade doesn't require a barrel to travel in a straight line. A barrel can be transferred ship to ship. It can be stored in a hub. It can be blended. Once blended, origin becomes harder to prove. Once paperwork changes hands multiple times, liability becomes diffuse. The network doesn't need perfect secrecy. It needs plausible deniability, and plausible deniability is enough to keep money moving. So when the U.S. seizes a ship, it's not only trying to stop one cargo, it's trying to shock the machine. It's trying to send a message that ambiguity is no longer safe. It's trying to make the cost of operating in the gray rise so high that the whole network becomes fragile. But here's where the story flips. When you shock a machine like this, it doesn't always collapse. Sometimes it militarizes, because once trade becomes contested, state power starts protecting logistics. And that's how you end up with commercial hulls being shadowed by naval assets. That's the point where the danger jumps a level, not because anyone wants a war, because the line between commerce and strategy disappears. And that is exactly why the China angle is combustible. China's role is not about flags and speeches, it's about gravity. China is the gravitational center of energy demand. When you have a buyer that large, routes will exist. If one route is blocked, flows bend. They reroute. They move through different hubs. They settle through different intermediaries. The market tries to remain liquid because demand doesn't vanish. So China's first lever is simple: absorb and reroute. If oil is pressured in one channel, China can keep demand alive through alternative routes. That doesn't require announcements. It's quiet. It's market behavior. But it changes the strategic picture because it blunts sanctions pressure. And when pressure is blunted, Washington faces a choice: accept limited outcomes or escalate enforcement to restore credibility. Credibility becomes the objective. That's when policy stops being about results and starts being about reputation. And reputation is where escalation happens. China's second lever is legitimacy. China can frame this kind of action as unilateral overreach, not to persuade Americans, but to persuade neutral states. Neutral states don't want a world where major powers seize ships under domestic law in international waters because they know they could be next. China can amplify that fear and quietly weaken the coalition environment that makes sanctions effective. China's third lever is asymmetric pressure. China does not need to confront the U.S. in the Atlantic to respond to Atlantic-style precedent. China can increase friction where the U.S. is already stretched: the Indo-Pacific. More patrols, more inspections, more gray zone encounters near contested sea lanes. Not necessarily war moves, but risk moves. The message is understood. If enforcement by force becomes normalized globally, then everyone will export their version of enforcement too. That's how one seizure becomes a system contest across oceans. Now, while politicians argue about law and morality, the global market reacts faster than diplomacy. And the market's most sensitive nerve in shipping is insurance. Insurance is the bloodstream of maritime trade. A tanker without insurance becomes a floating liability. Ports may refuse it. Banks avoid it. Counterparties hesitate. If a ship can't be insured, it can't operate normally. If it can't operate normally, it becomes a stranded asset. That means the real battlefield often isn't the ocean itself. It's the cost structure behind the ocean. It's the fear premium. When interdictions increase, when naval shadowing becomes common, insurers raise premiums. Shipping companies reroute, traders reprice, banks tighten. You don't need missiles to shake the economy, you need uncertainty. And once uncertainty becomes normal, it spreads into everything. Fuel costs, transport costs, food costs, manufacturing costs, inflation pressure. Politics gets harder, leaders get more reactive. And reactive leaders are how crises escalate. This is why Russia's smartest retaliation is not a direct naval fight. Russia's smartest retaliation is to create a risk tax that makes enforcement expensive and politically toxic. Russia can normalize escort and shadowing, not necessarily visible convoys, but presence, deterrence, and ambiguity. A submarine doesn't need to fire to change behavior. It only needs to exist in the right place at the right time. The message is silent but brutal. You can intercept, but you may pay for it. Russia can also create commercial friction, delays, selective detentions through friendly jurisdictions, aggressive shadowing that forces reroutes, navigation interference, close encounters that never become official attacks but still spike risk. None of this looks like war on paper, but all of it raises insurance premiums and erodes confidence. Then comes narrative warfare. Russia will push one framing non-stop: unilateral enforcement, abuse of jurisdiction, piracy. Again, it doesn't need everyone to agree. It only needs enough countries to hesitate. Coalition enforcement dies the moment allies start worrying about precedent. So now we arrive at the escalation ladder, the part that most people only understand after it's too late. Escalation rarely happens because leaders decide, today is war day. Escalation happens because both sides keep taking steps that feel rational in isolation, but create an unstable pattern in combination. The U.S. increases interdictions to prove enforcement credibility. Russia increases escort and shadowing to protect flag credibility. Encounters multiply. Near misses become normal. And once near misses become normal, incidents become inevitable. A collision, a warning shot, a misread maneuver, an injury. At sea, mistakes happen fast. And when both sides want to look tough, nobody wants to blink. This is where domestic politics becomes a weapon. After an incident, leaders stop optimizing for stability. They optimize for reputation. Because in great power competition, reputation is deterrence. Nobody wants to look weak. Everyone wants to show resolve, and that's how a tactical event becomes a strategic crisis. Now ask yourself what the actual endgame is, because unclear objectives are how you walk into traps. Is the U.S. trying to choke Venezuelan revenue? Is it punishing Russian protection of sanctioned trade? Is it sending a message to China's energy routes? Those are different goals and they require different strategies. If the goal is Venezuela's revenue, the most effective long-term strategy is financial and logistical. Ports, intermediaries, payments, compliance choke points, insurance, and classification. It's slow. It's boring. It's how you grind down a network. If the goal is Russia's behavior, the strategy becomes deterrence and escalation management. That's a different game. It's less about barrels and more about signaling and risk. If the goal is China's energy security posture, the game becomes global and multi-front. That's where you risk stretching yourself across oceans. Trying to play all three games at maximum intensity is how systems break. And that's why the Shadow Fleet story matters. Because it sits at the intersection of revenue, sovereignty, and global demand. It's not just economics. It's not just law. It's not just military. It's all of them at once. So how does this end without a shootout? Crises like this rarely end with victory. They end with off-ramps, face-saving exits that stop escalation before the system breaks. The smartest off-ramp removes humiliation from the equation, because humiliation is gasoline. If Russia feels publicly humiliated, it will look for a visible reversal to restore pride. If the U.S. feels publicly challenged, it will look for visible dominance to restore credibility. If China senses an opening, it will push advantage quietly, expanding strategic space without direct confrontation. Off-ramps look boring on purpose. Resolve the human element quickly, handle crew issues fast, emphasize humane treatment, lower emotional temperature, shift the story from force to procedure. Legal channels, administrative framing, process. Narrow messaging. Target specific sanction evasion networks rather than implying domestic law can govern the entire ocean. Give every side space to claim something without escalating. But if there is no off-ramp, the world drifts into a new normal. A normal where maritime trade prices in geopolitics as a permanent tax. Routes become strategic choices, not purely economic ones. Insurance becomes a constant surcharge. Shipping becomes politicized. And once shipping becomes politicized, navies become part of commerce. At that point, the question isn't whether there will be escalation. The question is when the first serious incident happens. Because in a contested maritime environment, incidents are not rare. They are inevitable. And here's the deepest danger. Once the system starts acting like the ocean is contested, it becomes true. Risk becomes routine. Pressure becomes normalized. Every encounter becomes a test. Every boarding becomes a signal. Every escort becomes a challenge. The system becomes accident-prone because it's operating closer to the edge. That's why this story is not just about a tanker. It's about the rules of the sea. It's about whether the world still believes international waters are governed by shared norms, or whether the world starts acting like the ocean is just another arena for power projection. The U.S. wants to prove sanctions still work. Russia wants to prove it can still resist and protect its flag. China wants to prove it can still secure energy and weaken U.S. legitimacy without firing a shot. Those objectives collide on the same ocean. So watch what happens next. Not the speeches, not the headlines. Watch the patterns. More escorts, more interdictions, more close encounters, more insurance spikes, more rerouted shipping, more gray zone friction in other theaters, more legitimacy battles in diplomatic forums, more quiet market adaptations around routes and intermediaries. That's how you know the system is shifting. Because the next war won't start with missiles. It will start the moment the world stops believing the ocean is neutral and starts acting like it's contested. And once the world acts that way, it becomes true.